You hear the screaming before you see the flames. High-pitched animal sounds that don't seem human anymore. The kind of noise that makes your stomach turn, that you'll hear in your sleep decades later if you're unlucky enough to survive hearing it now. You're standing in a monastery courtyard in the Serbian highlands, 1439, and you realize with cold certainty that Mercy died here hours ago. What's happening now isn't war. It's something else entirely. Something with a different name that history hasn't taught you yet. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me every single time that a story buried for 6 centuries can reach someone in Sao Paulo, Jakarta, or Oklahoma City all at once. The power of curiosity never gets old. The convent of the Holy Ascension sat on a limestone cliff overlooking the Morava River Valley. 43 women lived there. Most had taken their vows decades earlier, when Serbia was still a kingdom, when the cross still flew above fortresses that now lay in rubble. They grew herbs for healing. They copied manuscripts in a scriptorium that smelled of ink and beeswax. They sang vespers as the sun dropped behind mountains that had protected them for generations. Until the morning, those mountains became a trap. The Ottoman expansion into the Balkans between 1430 and 1460 followed a doctrine most Western histories gloss over. It wasn't simply conquest, it was a systematic program of cultural decomposition, outlined in administrative manuals called the canuname, that governed every aspect of imperial expansion. These weren't battlefield tactics. They were bureaucratic instructions for erasing civilizations one institution at a time. Churches, monasteries, convents. Each represented not just a building, but a living memory of the world that existed before. And memory, the Ottomans understood better than most empires, is more dangerous than any army. Sultan Murad II, whose reign from 1421 to 1451 saw the consolidation of Ottoman control over southeastern Europe, didn't issue orders to massacre Christian religious communities. That would have been crude, counterproductive. Massacres create martyrs, and martyrs inspire resistance for generations. Instead, his administrators developed something far more sophisticated, a process. And what happened to the nuns of the Holy Ascension was that process in action. The siege lasted 3 days. Not because the walls were strong, the convent had no walls, just a wooden gate and faith. It lasted 3 days because that was the protocol. On the first day, the Ottoman commander, a man named Ishak Bey, whose correspondence is preserved in the Istanbul State Archives, sent an emissary. The offer was standard: conversion or conscription. Accept Islam, join the empire's administrative networks, receive land and protection. The abbess, a woman named Mother Giovanna, who had led the convent for 18 years, gave an answer that appears in 3 separate historical accounts. We have already given our lives to a bridegroom. We have nothing left to negotiate. The soldiers didn't force the gate that night. They camped outside and sang. Ottoman military songs, victory hymns, the call to prayer echoing off the cliff walls at dawn. Psychological warfare perfected over decades of conquest. Let them hear the future. Let them understand that their world has already ended. They just haven't accepted it yet. On the second day, the offer changed. Not conversion, removal. The nuns would be relocated to Constantinople, placed in the service of the imperial household. Domestic work, nothing more. A Venetian merchant who witnessed similar scenes in Thessaloniki wrote that the Ottomans had perfected the art of making captivity sound like opportunity. They speak of service as if it were salvation, of chains as if they were gifts. Mother Giovanna asked for 1 night to pray over the decision. The commander granted it. Why not? Time was on his side. What happened that night inside the convent chapel is documented in a letter discovered in 1923 in the Vatican archives. Written by a Serbian priest who survived the siege by hiding in a grain cellar, it describes the nuns gathering for what they knew would be their final vigil. They sang the entire liturgy of St. John Chrysostom from memory. They took communion using the last of their wine and bread. And then Mother Giovanna did something that appears in no liturgical manual, no tradition, no precedent. She asked each woman, starting with the youngest, to make a choice. You can stay silent and let them take you. No one will judge you. You can say the words they want to hear. God knows your heart. Or you can walk with me into whatever comes next. Not as martyrs, we're not trying to die, but as women who will not become ghosts in our own skins. 43 women, 43 choices. The youngest was 14, a novice named Katerina whose family had died of plague 2 years earlier. The convent was the only home she remembered. She stood first and said simply, "I will walk with you, Mother." One by one, they stood, all 43. But here's the part that breaks through the centuries like a scream. They weren't choosing death. They were choosing visibility. They were refusing to disappear quietly into the machinery of empire, to become unnamed servants in palaces they'd never see, to let their faith become a private whisper in the dark. They were choosing to make their resistance loud enough that someone, someday, might remember it happened. On the third day, when Ishak Bey entered the courtyard, he found them waiting, hands folded, eyes forward, singing, a hymn in Serbian so old even they probably didn't know its origins. He didn't stop them. He let them sing until the song ended naturally, trailing off into the morning air. Then he gave an order that doesn't appear in any official Ottoman military record but shows up in 4 separate eyewitness accounts from Serbian, Greek, Venetian, and even one Ottoman source, a letter from a soldier to his brother, discovered in Ankara in 1978. Burn it with them inside. This wasn't standard procedure. The Canonime outlined clear protocols: remove, relocate, convert, or conscript. Execution was reserved for armed resistance, for soldiers and rebels, not for women who had done nothing but refuse an offer. But Ishak Bey understood something the bureaucrats in Constantinople didn't always grasp. There are moments when the process fails, when refusal becomes contagious, when 43 women singing in the face of empire become more dangerous than 43 soldiers with swords. So he made an example. The doors were barred from the outside. Kindling was piled against the wooden walls. Torches were lit. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. Because they didn't stop singing. Even as the smoke began to curl through the gaps in the wood, even as the heat became unbearable, even as younger sisters began to cough and collapse, the voices continued. Eyewitnesses from the valley below, farmers, refugees, people who had already fled their villages and were watching from the tree line, reported hearing the hymn for almost an hour. The Serbian priest who survived wrote, "I have seen men die in battle. I have seen children starve. I have seen villages burned and bodies left for crows, but I had never heard anything like those voices. They weren't screaming. They weren't begging. They were singing as if they had already left their bodies behind and were calling to us from somewhere else, as if they were showing us it was possible to choose how you leave the world." When the walls finally collapsed, it took 2 days for the embers to cool enough to approach. Ottoman soldiers were ordered to clear the site, to remove any trace of what had happened. But something went wrong with the erasure. Or maybe something went right. Because 23 years later, in 1462, a Serbian monk returning to the region found the ruins. And carved into the foundation stones too heavy to move, too deep in the earth to burn, he found names. Not all 43, just 7. Scratched into the limestone with something sharp, probably done in the hours before the siege ended, before the choice became final. Katarina, Milica, Teodora, Jovana, Magdalena, Yelena, Sarana. 7 women who knew they were about to vanish and refused to let that be the end of their story. Who took the time, in the darkness, in the fear, to carve proof into stone that they had existed, that they had names, that they had chosen this. The monk recorded the names in his chronicle. That chronicle was copied and recopied across Serbian monasteries for the next 3 centuries. During the Ottoman occupation, when possessing such documents was grounds for execution, monks hid the texts in walls, buried them in gardens, carried them across borders sewn into the linings of their robes. Not because the story was heroic in the way we usually think of heroism, but because it was true, because it was a record of what empire does when it doesn't get its way, and because those 7 names, scratched into stone by women who had hours left to live, deserved to outlast the empire that tried to erase them. The Ottoman Empire banned the construction of new Christian churches throughout most of the Balkans for the next 400 years. Existing ones could remain, barely under suffocating restrictions. But the message was clear. Your world is ending, and we will not allow you to build monuments to remember it. Yet those names survived, in monastic chronicles, in oral histories passed from priest to priest, in the folk song Serbian grandmothers sang to children centuries later without even knowing why the words mattered. The empire controlled the present, but it never controlled the past. In 1876, during the Serbian uprising against Ottoman rule, a battalion of rebels camped near the ruins of the Holy Ascension. An old woman from a nearby village, she must have been 70, maybe older, walked into their camp uninvited. She carried a basket of bread and a flask of plum brandy, offerings for the soldiers. But before she left, she knelt by the foundation stones and traced her fingers over carvings that had been there for 437 years. Then she looked at the young men with rifles and said something that one of them recorded in his diary. My grandmother's grandmother knew these names. She taught them to my grandmother. My grandmother taught them to my mother. My mother taught them to me. I don't know if they were saints. I don't know if they were heroes. But I know they were here. And I know they didn't bow. That's the legacy. Not theology, not martyrdom, not some grand narrative about faith triumphing over empire, just the stubborn, inexplicable, utterly human refusal to let silence have the final word. The Ottoman Empire dissolved in 1922. Its sultans are dust. Its armies are museum exhibits. The administrative manuals that outlined how to erase cultures are studied by historians as cautionary tales. But those 7 names, carved into limestone by women with hours left to live, are still there. You can visit the site. It's a memorial now, rebuilt in the 1990s. People leave flowers, light candles, stand in silence, and if you're quiet enough, if the wind is moving through the valley just right, you can almost convince yourself you hear singing. The Ottomans thought they understood power. They had conquered 3 continents, rewritten entire cultures, turned the greatest cathedral in Christendom into a mosque. They had endless resources, administrative genius, the will to reshape the world. And they lost to 43 women with nothing but their voices and a piece of sharp stone. Not in the way empires measure victory. There were no battles won, no territory reclaimed, no political reversals. But in the only way that actually matters in the long run. The women are remembered. The commander's name survives only in archives. The empire is gone. The names are still there. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. It's not a metaphor. It's not poetry. It's a documentary fact about what happens when you try to erase people who refuse to be forgotten. You can burn the building. You can scatter the ashes. You can ban the songs and outlaw the language and rewrite the maps. But you cannot kill what gets carved into stone. And you cannot silence what gets carried forward in whispers, in songs, in the hands of old women, tracing letters they learned from grandmothers who learned them from grandmothers who learned them from the smoke and the ruins, and the stubborn insistence that some things are worth remembering even when remembering them is dangerous. 43 women walked into fire singing. 7 of them left their names behind. And 586 years later, you know they existed. That's not faith. That's not even defiance. That's just the strange, inexplicable mathematics of human memory. The thing empires can never quite calculate. the detail they always miss in their plans. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.